Hey, thanks for watching another video from weldingtipsandtricks.com. Today I'm going to remove a broken tap out of this piece of stainless steel. Now this is 316 stainless steel. It's really tough, really hard to machine, difficult to machine, very common for a tap to break in something like this, especially when the tapping is done using a CNC turning center. We're going to use a hastelloy W filler rod today, but there is a couple other choices. 309 and 312 stainless will also work pretty well. And the first thing is just to light up with a good sharp electrode using the smallest electrode that you can, which usually is a 1/16 electrode will do something like this really easily. You're probably not going to ever get over about 50 amps just puddling. So I'm just letting the heat soak into that tap right here. And the reason being is taps are made out of a high strength, high speed steel, which means it's got a lot of carbon. It's also got some elements sometimes like chromium and vanadium that contribute to hardening and let the thing be heat treated, but all that stuff needs to be softened up a little bit and soaking the heat into it for a little while before even adding rod generally helps to make it a little less brittle, and that's what you want, because the problem is the thing breaking off right where the weld joins it. So I am just dabbing filler rod in here, dabbing that hastelloy W rod in there, feathering the foot pedal just enough to where it just puddles the top and doesn't mushroom it and let it sink down all around the part. And actually, last thing I want to do is weld it to the part. And now I'm just moving around, kind of contouring, kind of adding some ears on this thing, because I'm going to put a pair of vice grips on it. Now you could also just weld a stainless nut on this thing, but I don't have one handy, so I'm just building it up to such a shape where I can get vice grips on it. And that worked a little bit, but it didn't act like the vice grips didn't really want to get a good grip on it. So now I'm just adding a little bit more, contouring it, kind of making it shaped like a football, like the jaws of my vice grips that I'm going to use. And I'm got this sped up here a little bit because it's kind of a tedious process. It takes a little while. And there you go. Now the vice grips will bite onto that pretty well. Now you'd be surprised what you can do if you got a nice TIG machine with a low start and a foot pedal. You can really control the amps, and you can make some real weird shapes like this little titanium dog. But anyway, that's another story. So the vice grips here are biting on this thing just about like they should, and I've got a lot of leverage on this particular pair of vice grips because this is actually a stud puller that I made a couple of years ago with a slide hammer on the end, and it's really handy for pulling out pins and things like that. But also it just gives me a lot of leverage on things like this because it's an extra 18 inches or so. So get a lot of leverage on this, and I didn't even put any lubricant on it. I could feel that it gave right away pretty easy, and I got kind of lucky on this tap. A lot of times you have to put a little penetrating oil, maybe even some candle wax sometimes. You can see how much weld metal it took to build up from the broken head of that tap to get it something where I could grip hold of. Now this is a pressed in steel pin and a big chunk of aluminum that the machinist tried to drill out and just couldn't get any further than this. So I did this years ago, and I decided to show it again here because it's the same type of thing that can be done with those pullers. Now first off, you need a really sharp electrode of the smallest diameter that you can, which is generally a 1/16. A 3/32 will work too if you sharpen it up real needle sharp. And then just get down in there on something like this, and again let the heat soak for just a little while. Be really careful not to move the arc over to the piece that you don't want welded. In this case, it'd be difficult to make that aluminum melt because the steel melts it so much more easily, and that big chunk of aluminum. But I'm just building it up and just building and building and feathering the foot pedal. Just using just enough amperage to where I get a little kind of a pumpkin ball there, but no bigger than that. And if it starts to get too big, I just back off and keep adding rod, keep adding upward. And then I start going around like this with less amperage to put a round head on it that I can grab with a pair of vice grips, and then they'll give me something to grab with those pullers, and then I can pull it out. And we'll do that here again real quickly, another little round just to get something to grab onto. and that is that. The pullers will the jaws of the vice grips. This is an old pair that I've had for years and years. I made that newer pair, but they're just very handy, and all you need is a piece of weight. You can get a block of steel with a hole drilled in it, or some old slide hammer that got scrapped or something. It doesn't really matter. And this particular vice grips has just got a groove worn in there with a carbide burr, and they're really good for grabbing stuff like this. And they just pop it right out. You see how deep that pin was in there, so that's why it was just tough to get it out. Now this is how I would make a pair. I got a slide hammer here from a flea market type shop for $5 or $10, and I like for the arm of the slide hammer, the shaft, to line up as close to possible with the pull of the jaws. If you get them crooked, sometimes if you got a really tough pin to pull out, it'll get a little torque on it and it'll snap it off. So the straighter the pull, the better when you're making a set of these like this. And what I did in order to do that, I just left this little block on here that was for like a stud puller for auto body work. I just left it on there and cut an angle, and that gives me a nice place to weld and keeps the shaft pretty much in line, right straight in line with the way the jaws will grab something, so I get a really straight pull when I'm grabbing something and snatching on it. So I just MIG welded this one on here. I could have also TIG welded it, in which case just a plain old ER70S2 rod would have worked just fine. I just decided to very quickly run a MIG bead all the way around it, and that worked out just fine that day. As long as you get the pull straight, doesn't really matter how you weld it, what you weld it with. This is a broken stud on a cast iron exhaust manifold. And just thought I'd show that again here because the same techniques apply. You want to just get some heat on that stud, take your time, let it soak for a while, because the hotter you can get the actual broken stud, the more it'll shrink in that area where it did get hot enough, and you want it to shrink because it's frozen up in there, and it's going to be hard to come out. Also, this is where once this is welded and still hot, some candle wax. I learned this after the fact. A lot of people commented and said candle wax was a good thing because it had a much higher flash point than some oils, and so it would get down in there better without just completely, vaporizing like some oils will when it's just too hot. So I am just building up again building up this stud just in the same way that I was the pin, and the same way that I was the broken tap. Just slowly adding filler metal to it. And you can see why a foot pedal is necessary, because a lot of times you might only be at 10 amps here or so, maybe even less sometimes. Once you get all that heat built up, it just doesn't take much amperage to melt a drop of rod or two to put on there. And obviously, if you on some machines that might only go down to 20 or 30 amps, it might be a problem. But the foot pedal is definitely the way to go on something like this. You can see that's a freshly broken area there. That's because it didn't work the first time, and a lot of times you have to go after it again, and a lot of times that second time or the third time will be a charm. It finally gets enough heat down into that stud to do the deal. You've got to be careful not to let it puddle. See, it's trying to puddle over on some of that scaled rusted area. I've got to really direct the heat just on the stud, try to keep it there, and because it's not going to help anybody if I weld it all to the cast iron itself. It's going to be a problem. So I'll build this up and then put a nut on this and give it another try, and we'll speed it up from here on out, so it all looks pretty much the same. It's just kind of a slow process, so speeding it up helps a little bit here. Once I get enough on it, just put the nut on there and then let it all cool off, and then actually wound up having to heat the cast iron part, the manifold itself, to let it expand and break that thing, the bond, however it was seized up in there, was rusted or whatever. But anyway, that's what did the trick. That's when it broke loose and surrendered. And so, whether it's a broken tap or a broken stud or a pin, sometimes you have to go after them 2 or 3 times. But if you're patient and you let the heat soak in there at first a little bit, usually you win. All right, well, that is it for this week. you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel yet, let me show you a few things we got coming up where you might want to subscribe so you don't miss anything. Doing a little pulse TIG welding at a slow pulse at 0.7 pulses a second, showing those parameters, welding these bungs in here. Also some heat input information, difference between using different types of welding speeds and welding techniques, and comparing them to other techniques and the difference in the amount of heat input. That's going to be pretty interesting. Also, how to get backup gas, purge gas to the backside of something without having to purge the entire insides out. So that's going to be something interesting, how to build one of those things, and also some welding techniques. And one more thing, if you're not aware, we got a forum over at forum.weldingtipsandtricks.com. It's a really good forum, a lot of active members with a whole lot of welding knowledge, and it's a really friendly, helpful bunch. Well, as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.